So I'm using Daniel Smith's Primatek colours, and more details about these colours and alternatives can be found in the description below. So I'm using a large brush to wet the paper down to the horizon. This is going to be the sky, so really take your time wetting the paper. I'm using a watercolour block. I'm using my plastic card now to dip in to the Sugilite and Piemontite genuine. One's a grey, that's the Sugilite, makes these beautiful colours, and the Piemontite is a warmer sort of dark red colour. Daniel Smith makes these amazing Primatek colours which create fantastic granulation effects, beautiful colours. They kind of disperse on the paper and you get these sort of different colours just from one colour. I will put a link in the description below where Daniel Smith on their website describe how they make these colours, and it is truly fascinating. So I've used the Mayan blue there with the Sugilite genuine, and I'm using these colours straight from the tube with this plastic card onto the wet surface, and you can see they start to blend and mix together on the paper, and the paint gets diluted and starts to kind of escape and drift above. It's attracted to the water above, so it starts moving. So these are quite sort of moody colours, and I was really excited about using them. So I'm just gently spritzing here. That warm glow comes from the Piemontite genuine. So what I love is that these different colours come out of one colour. So I'm mixing them together here, creating a very dilute colour using the Sugilite genuine with a pinch of the Piemontite and a little bit of the Mayan blue. So you can really vary your colours here. This is a little bit more of the Mayan mixed with the Piemontite, and I'm painting that wet into wet. As I say, I will have colour alternatives below. They won't create these amazing effect that the Primatek colours do have, but you could use a little bit of Payne's Grey and Burnt Sienna with a pinch of red, or even a little bit of alizarin crimson. But I will put alternatives in the description below and you can have a little play. But there's no drawing here, as I said. This is purely from my imagination. I started off using those colours on the horizon line, maybe to sort of create the look of buildings, but they kind of look like trees, so I'm going with it. I'm painting smaller marks as I go towards the horizon. That will create depth in my painting. I'm using a large brush. You can see how wet everything is, and I'm just letting everything flow down naturally, just getting it to mix on the paper. Mixing a little bit more of the Mayan blue, sort of more damp into wet. The paper is still quite wet, and I am using 300 grams of 100% cotton paper because it doesn't actually warp as much as other papers that aren't 100% cotton. It's on a block, so it's actually gummed all the way around the edge except for one little gap at the top where you can remove the paper once you've finished the painting. And what that does, it helps prevent warping. It's not perfect, but it really does, for me, do a good job because I do like working wet into wet. So I'm just adding a little bit more of the Piemontite genuine, a little bit of the Mayan blue there, and just working damp or even wet into wet. I'm deliberately using a large brush in order for me to keep loose so I don't tighten up. I'm just tickling on the paint here, and it's turning into quite a sort of moody, stormy scene. And as I say at the beginning, I didn't really have much in mind. I like to respond to what happens with the watercolour and go with the flow, pardon the pun. So a little bit more of the Piemontite genuine and the Sugilite. I love saying those words. But you can start to see some interesting textures, etc. happening there. And I'm just experimenting here just to see what happens, creating this atmospheric sky, damp into wet. I want a little bit more light here, so I'm just using my spritzer bottle to spritz off the paint, tilting to allow the paint to flow off the edge, and it just creates a little bit more light in my sky. What I'm doing now is I'm using the plastic card and I'm lifting off the damp paint that I painted previously to create these light coloured tree trunks and branches, and it's really effective. It's just quite nice just to create some light and detail there along the horizon. So mixing up a little bit more of the Mayan blue here with the Sugilite Genuine, just to paint some smaller clouds along the sort of horizon there, damp into wet. I'm just tickling in a little bit more paint here, varying the shape of the clouds using my size 4 round brush. You can see I'm still tilting to get the paint to move. A little bit of Mayan blue there, sort of damp into wet, just to add a little bit more shadow underneath the clouds. And again, spritzing, allowing that paint to flow down, and even just above the trees it could create some nice textures there as well. So I'm just letting everything flow, and I love all those textures in the paint just above there in the middle of the sky. You can see all the wonderful textures these Primatek colours create. I'm removing the washi tape, and I've got a lovely straight edge there. So I've already composed my painting. So I've loaded my brush with clean water, and I'm wetting the foreground going into the middle ground, being careful not to touch what I've previously painted. So I've left a little white gap, a long thin line on the horizon. So I'm mixing up here a little bit of Quinacridone gold with some Cascade green. You can use Hooker's green. It's very dilute, and I'm painting that right up to the horizon. You've got a little bit of sparkle there just at the top where I've got some dry brush effect. A little bit more of the Cascade green with the Quin gold there in the foreground, wet into wet, using some phthalo blue here, probably a little bit too much, so it's quite dark, so I'm adding some Quin gold, and I'm painting this wet into wet in the foreground, so it's a stronger colour, even stronger here, a little bit more phthalo blue. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to tilt that colour. So I've got sort of like a dark green, mid greens and very light green. I just want to tilt there just to get everything moving, to look quite natural there, like grasses, the tops of grasses. So I am using the bottom of my paintbrush, it's size 4. So it's just the handle of the brush. I'm just pulling up the paint gently, allowing it to kind of flow into that lighter coloured paint. So it kind of diffuses, but it's really soft, and it's just a nice way of painting soft grasses. I'm using my brush now and just adding some of that Cascade green with a pinch of yellow, and just letting the brush dance. And this is damp into wet, and it's a size 4 brush. I've added some more Quin gold. It's slightly thicker and darker there. So the paint's slightly thicker so it doesn't run too much. So you get the control when you're working damp into wet. So I'm mixing up a slightly darker green here. You can add a touch more blue, bit of Quin gold. So I've actually mixed up some yellow, pinch of green with the Quin gold. I'm painting wet into wet with my size 4 brush, just to paint some smaller marks as the grasses go off into the distance, so it kind of looks further away. I'm mixing up some more of the Quin gold here with a pinch of the phthalo blue, just to make it a little bit darker and creamier. Took the excess there off on the palette. Add a touch more Quin gold, so it's kind of a mid to dark green, and I'm painting this damp into wet with my size 4 brush, and it's quite nice because it kind of brings it to life. I'm painting this kind of underneath that lighter green colour for some shadow and a little bit more detail. I'm actually tilting as well just to get the paint moving. Bigger marks here as I paint towards the foreground, still using the size 4 brush. Adding a few more darks, wet into wet here, and I'm sprinkling some table salt onto the damp surface to allow it to absorb the paint to create some light textures. Meanwhile, just adding a few more grasses here and there. I'm literally kind of pushing the paint up rather than adding more paint there. So mixing up some more Quinacridone gold with the green, painting damp into wet, just building up those sort of details there, making those grasses look fuller. Adding a little bit more to the middle ground there, damp into wet with my size 4 round brush. Just adding some of the Quinacridone gold here, damp into damp on some of the grasses for some warmth. And I've spritzed the foreground there just to lighten some of those grasses. I'm just taking off the excess paint. I've decided to add some bulrushes, a little bit of detail to the foreground. So using red and burnt sienna, painting damp into damp with my size 4 round brush. A little bit more burnt sienna with a pinch of the phthalo blue just to make it a touch darker. So I'm just adding these sort of details in the foreground to create depth and interest as well. I'm just scratching into the surface of the watercolour paper because it's wet and the paint is quite dark. The darker paint runs into the scratch to create very thin dark lines. It's really effective if you want to sort of paint stems, etc. Remember, this is permanent and you may need to practice it. So I've decided to spritz off some of the paint here on the left hand side of my painting. I wanted it to match the light on the right hand side, so it's just softened it there. And because I'd added salt in the foreground previously but I'd spritzed it away, I'm just adding the salt again, hopefully to create some lovely textures. And I'm going to allow the painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. And as you can see there, it's worked so well. I'm delighted. So I'm using a lifting off technique here, using some framing tape. You can use washi tape or masking tape, and it's to create a rectangle, and it's for a little house. So I'm using a little brush here just to lift off the paint, using a paper towel to take any excess off, and I'm removing the tape now to reveal a light rectangle for my house. And I'm just sketching in the rooftop and the side of the house. You can use a sponge to lift off. So I'm going to paint the rooftop with a little bit of burnt sienna using my size 4 round brush. Wet on dry. I'm actually painting on top of a darker colour, so it does make that burnt sienna with a pinch of red a lovely sort of dark colour there. Just painting the side of the rooftop there as well. I'm mixing up here a little bit of burnt sienna with Payne's grey, and I'm using the size 4 brush, and I'm just painting the negative shape here. That's the sort of shape next to the edge of the house. I just want to darken it up a little bit to create a bush or something like that, so it brings out the side of the house. Even though the side of the house is in shade, I still want to make it the star of the show. So just adding a little bit more dark over the rooftop to the left there, wet on dry, and just adding a few more darks to the right here, wet on dry. And it's just to really bring out that little white cottage. Just adding a little bit of dark just beneath the house as well, just to create a little bit of detail, and again to draw attention to it, to make it the focal point and the star of the show. So just diluting some of that dark to make some small little bushes in front of the cottage. Just mixing up some ultramarine here with the burnt sienna. And I'm just painting a bit of shadow underneath the eaves, wet on dry, and a touch more shadow around the left hand side of the house. Painting in some windows here, wet on dry, using Payne's grey with a pinch of burnt sienna, and adding a little chimney pot as well. I'm adding a little bit of darks and details now to the bulrushes or the plants in the foreground from my imagination. And I'm just stippling using my size 4 brush, and I'm using some burnt sienna, pinch of red with a pinch of ultramarine or even Payne's grey to make it slightly darker. So as you can see, it really pulls the plants away from the middle ground there to create depth in the painting. What I quite like about these is that they're similar coloured to the rooftop, so you've got some colour harmony as well in your painting, and there's even a little pinch of that colour in the sky as well. So I'm quite pleased with the sort of colour harmony in this painting. So I'm just continuing on here, just adding a few textures, mixing up some green here, and just painting in a few grasses, wet on dry with my size 4 brush, and also some stems too as well, just to pull the sort of plants away from that middle ground there to create depth in my painting. Here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, straight from my imagination. If you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Just click Patreon in the description below and you will get access to my exclusive tutorials and downloadable outline sketches. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.